October 1944. Leyte Gulf, the Philippines. The air is thick, a heavy blanket of salt spray and the copper tang of blood. On the ridges overlooking the beaches, the tropical rain does not cleanse. It only turns the volcanic soil into a viscous, waist-deep slurry that swallows the living and the dead alike. Beneath the canopy of shredded palms, the silence is punctuated only by the rhythmic mechanical thrum of a distant armada. A young Imperial Japanese soldier, his uniform reduced to a collection of rot-weakened rags held together by grime and desperation, presses his cheek against the wet earth. His senses are overwhelmed. He smells the scorched ozone of naval gunfire and the sweet, sickly stench of gangrene. In his ears, the sound of the American Great White Fleet moving closer is not just the sound of an enemy. It is the sound of an industrial heartbeat, steady and unstoppable, thumping against the fragile ribcage of his island world. He has been told for years that the Westerners are spiritually hollow, a decadent race that would crumble when faced with the divine steel of the Emperor's will. Yet, as the horizon fills with a forest of steel masts and the sky turns gray with the smoke of 1,000 funnels, the reality of the Pacific begins to shift. This was the precipice of a total collapse, not just of a military front, but of an entire psychological universe. The soldiers of the rising sun had been conditioned to believe that material lack was a badge of honor, that a hungry belly and a rusted rifle were merely tests of their superior spirit. They lived in a world where supply lines were a secondary concern to the purity of the heart. But here, in the mud of Leyte, the spiritual was being crushed by the material. The American logistical machine was not merely arriving, it was terraforming the island. Massive steel ramps hissed as they hit the sand, vomiting forth a torrent of olive-drab trucks, crates, and men who looked as though they had stepped out of a different century. To the Japanese soldier watching from the brush, the sheer scale of the intrusion was incomprehensible. He looked at his own hands, blistered, shaking, and empty of even a single spare round of ammunition. He had been promised that the Americans were cowards who relied on machines because they feared to die. But as the first waves of GIs moved inland, he saw something more terrifying than courage. He saw a precision that suggested they did not intend to die at all. They intended to win through the sheer weight of their existence. The mud under his fingernails felt like the weight of a dying empire, while the vibrating ground beneath him heralded the arrival of a civilization that viewed war not as a ritual of sacrifice, but as a problem of engineering. The shadow of the American fleet grew long over the jungle, a dark, looming promise that the world he knew was about to be unraveled, thread by agonizing thread. To understand the depth of the shock felt by the Japanese soldier, one must look toward the marrow of the Imperial Army's philosophy. For decades, the Japanese military establishment had cultivated a culture where material poverty was not a logistical failure, but a spiritual prerequisite. This was the Seishin doctrine, the belief that the intangible power of the human spirit could overcome any physical obstacle. In the training camps of Honshu and Kyushu, recruits were taught that a Japanese bayonet, wielded by a man of pure resolve, was superior to 1,000 American shells fired by a man of soft character. They were told that the Americans were a nation of shopkeepers and factory hands, people who relied on the crutch of machinery because they lacked the Yamato Damashii, the primordial soul of Japan. This ideological conditioning created a specific set of expectations. The enemy would be physically impressive but mentally brittle, prone to panic once their comforts were stripped away. History shows that this reliance on spiritualism served as a convenient mask for a desperate lack of resources. While the American GI moved with the support of a global supply chain, the Japanese soldier was often expected to forage or simply starve with dignity. By 1944, the average imperial soldier was a master of making do with nothing. He mended his uniform with plant fibers and sharpened bamboo to replace lost steel. To him, the very concept of supply was alien. You were given your equipment once, and if it broke or was lost, it was a mark of shame upon your spirit. This created a profound emotional contrast. The Japanese soldier entered the Pacific theater expecting to face a weak, pampered adversary who would flee when the housewife kits and chocolate bars ran out. They believed the abundance of the West was its greatest vulnerability, a sign of a people who had lost the ability to suffer. They did not yet realize that the abundance they mocked was actually the ultimate expression of a democracy's power, the ability to provide for the smallest needs of its citizens, even in the heart of a global slaughter. The spiritual shield they carried was about to meet the industrial sword, and the resulting fracture would be absolute. The transition from the chaos of the jungle to the clinical order of the American stockade was a journey through a looking glass. When the Japanese soldier finally emerged from the brush, hands raised, skin clinging to bone, his uniform more holes than fabric, he was met by a reality that defied every military manual he had ever memorized. He was no longer a warrior of the emperor. He was a guest of a logistical empire. The GIs who processed him did not look like men who had been fighting a war for years. They were clean-shaven, their fatigue jackets were made of heavy, unfrayed herringbone twill, and their boots were thick-soled and sturdy. To the prisoner, they appeared less like soldiers and more like guardians of a vast, industrial treasury. As he stood in the processing line, the contrast was visceral. He looked down at his own tunic, which had been mended dozens of times with clumsy stitches of dried grass and scrap wire, and then at the American sergeant standing before him. The sergeant's uniform was crisp, every button accounted for, every seam straight. It was an offensive display of health and equipment. This moment of capture served as the first physical evidence that the spirit of the Imperial Army had been outmatched by the standardization of the American factory. In the holding pens, the prisoners were stripped of their rotting gear and bathed, a process that stripped away their identity as soldiers of a starving army and rebranded them as subjects of American care. They were given clean clothes, often surplus U.S. Navy denims or Army fatigues, that felt impossibly heavy and durable. The Japanese soldiers touched the fabric with a mixture of reverence and fear. They had been told the Americans were soft, yet the Americans wore clothing that was tougher than anything a Japanese general could procure in 1944. There was a quiet, haunting precision to the way the Americans operated. Everything was counted, everything was catalogued, and everything was replaced without a second thought. For a man who had been taught that a single lost canteen was a crime against the state, watching a GI toss aside a slightly bent tent peg as if it were trash was a psychological blow. The stockade was not a place of torture, but it was a place of deep ideological friction, where the threadbare reality of the rising sun met the reinforced seams of the American century. The inventory of abundance began at the shoreline, where the American logistical engine had constructed a city of wood and steel in a matter of days. From the vantage point of the prison transport, the Japanese soldiers peered through the slats of the trucks, their eyes widening at a spectacle of supply that defied their understanding of modern warfare. On the beaches of Leyte and Saipan, the horizon was no longer a line of water and sky, but a solid wall of hulls. Mountains of crates rose from the sand, stacked 20 feet high and stretching for miles, each one containing more food, medicine, and ammunition than an entire Japanese division would see in a year. There were mounds of coal, rows of fuel drums that shimmered in the heat, and a constant, thundering procession of bulldozers carving roads out of the primeval mud. For men who had spent months rationing a single bowl of moldy rice and counting their final 3 bullets, the sight was a violent disruption of their reality. They had been told that the American home front was a place of strikes, riots, and starvation caused by U-boat blockades. Instead, they were witnessing the output of a continent that was not merely supporting a war, but overproducing it. The historical reality of American logistics was a testament to a victory of the factories. While the Japanese High Command viewed logistics as a secondary concern, a mere footnote to the warrior spirit, the Americans treated it as the primary weapon. The prisoners watched as GIs opened crates not with the careful desperation of a starving man, but with the casual efficiency of a worker at a construction site. They saw men eating meat from cans that were discarded half-finished, and they watched as trucks were driven into ditches and simply abandoned because a replacement was already idling on the pier. This was the great wave of American material, a surplus so vast that it appeared to the POWs as a force of nature rather than a human endeavor. They began to realize that they weren't just fighting a military. They were fighting an industrial civilization that had weaponized its middle-class comfort. The sheer volume of equipment, the trucks, the cranes, the endless rolls of wire, served as a silent, devastating interrogation of everything they had been taught to believe. It was the physical manifestation of a truth they could no longer ignore. The spirit cannot defeat the machine when the machine is backed by the infinite resources of a free people. In the sterile, floodlit environment of the prisoner processing center, the Japanese soldiers were handed a small, olive-drab canvas roll. At first, many hesitated, fearing it was a trick or a subtle instrument of humiliation. This was the M1933 housewife sewing kit, a standard-issue item for every American serviceman. To the Japanese POW, who had spent the last 3 years in a world where a needle was a family heirloom and a spool of thread was a luxury reserved for the elite, the object was an anomaly. It was compact, secured with a simple tie, and felt strangely heavy for its size. As the soldiers sat on their cots and unrolled the canvas, they found an array of tools that seemed more appropriate for a professional tailor than a common infantryman. Inside were multiple needles of varying sizes, several spools of high-tensile olive-drab and tan thread, a thimble, a small pair of folding scissors, and an assortment of spare buttons for both fatigues and overcoats. The symbolic object, the needle, shimmered under the electric lights of the barracks. For the Japanese soldier, the housewife was a physical contradiction to everything he had been taught about the American character. His superiors had insisted that the Americans were a people of waste, men who would discard their equipment at the first sign of trouble. Yet, here was evidence of a culture that prioritized the meticulous maintenance of the individual. The kit was not a luxury, it was a tool of preservation. The soldiers ran their calloused fingers over the smooth, waxed thread and the cold steel of the needles. In the Imperial Army, a man's uniform was often allowed to rot off his back as a testament to his focus on the spiritual over the material. To see that the American government, a decadent democracy, had bothered to mass-produce and distribute such high-quality repair kits to millions of men was a revelation. It suggested a level of care and foresight that was terrifying in its implications. The initial suspicion of the POWs slowly curdled into a quiet, brooding curiosity. They watched the American guards casually use the kits to replace a button or close a small tear in a sleeve, performing the task with a nonchalance that suggested this abundance was infinite. To the Japanese, the kit represented a hidden layer of American strength, the strength of infrastructure. The needle was not just a piece of wire. It was a product of a factory that had the surplus energy to care about a soldier's hemline while simultaneously building the bombers that were leveling Tokyo. The housewife began to act as a silent interrogator, its presence asking a question that no amount of Seishin training could answer. How can a collapsing nation provide its lowest-ranking soldiers with the tools of a craftsman? As the prisoners sat in the silence of the camp, mending their own borrowed American denims with the provided kits, the act of sewing became an act of psychological surrender. Every stitch through the heavy fabric was a stitch through the heart of the propaganda they had lived by. The needle was sharp, and it was beginning to pierce the veil of their indoctrinated reality. The factual disruption occurred during the quiet, clinical hours of interrogation, where the high-altitude maps and strategic charts were replaced by the mundane contents of a soldier's pockets. When Japanese officers and NCOs were brought before intelligence sections, they were often confronted with an inventory of American life that proved more devastating than any artillery barrage. Factual records from the prisoner-of-war camps in the Pacific and at Angel Island highlight a recurring theme of disbelief. The interrogators did not need to use force. They simply displayed the standard equipment of a captured American private. Among the most potent of these exhibits was the housewife kit. Japanese officers, men who had achieved high rank through years of sacrifice and who still struggled to maintain a presentable appearance, were shown that even the lowest-ranking American cook or clerk possessed high-grade steel needles and industrial-strength thread. The data was inescapable. A single American division possessed more repair capacity and logistical foresight than an entire Japanese corps. The documented reactions of these Japanese leaders revealed a profound sense of betrayal. They had been led to believe that the United States was a nation whose industry was paralyzed by the greed of capitalists and the laziness of workers. However, the evidence in the interrogation room suggested a society that was unified in its pursuit of perfection, down to the last button. The kits were not handmade by grieving mothers. They were products of high-speed automation, identical in every camp from North Africa to the Philippines. The realization hit home that if the American factory could produce millions of these intricate kits with such ease, their capacity for producing tanks and planes was likely equally infinite. Quotes from declassified post-war summaries describe Japanese veterans looking at the sewing kits and remarking that they had been sent to fight a ghost, a version of America that did not exist. They found themselves forced to reconcile the myth of the feeble Westerner with the reality of an enemy who was so wealthy that he could afford to give his soldiers the tools to be self-sufficient. This factual disruption was the beginning of the end for the imperial ideology, as the needle pierced the bubble of their isolation, revealing a world where the American worker was the most formidable soldier of all. As the POWs spent more time within the confines of the American camps, the housewife kit began to exert a subtle but corrosive influence on their ideological foundations. The thread of doubt was quite literally being woven into their daily lives. In the Imperial Japanese Army, softness was considered a fatal flaw, and the American lifestyle was frequently described by propaganda as a cotton candy existence, sweet, hollow, and easily dissolved. However, the thread provided in the sewing kits was anything but hollow. It was a heavy-duty, mercerized cotton or linen synthetic blend, designed to withstand the rigors of combat and the abrasive nature of jungle rot. As the prisoners used this thread to repair their own garments, they noticed its incredible tensile strength. It did not snap under tension. It held. This physical resilience became a metaphor for the American war effort itself. The psychological shift was marked by an obsession with the mundane details of the kit. The prisoners would marvel at the variety of buttons, small, olive-drab plastic for the shirts, and larger, more durable versions for the trousers. Each button was identical to the next, a feat of mass production that suggested an economy operating at a level of efficiency that Japan simply could not match. The propaganda had insisted that American industry was a disorganized mess of competing interests, yet the sewing kit proved that the Americans had achieved a terrifying degree of standardization. If they could standardize the diameter of a button to the tenth of a millimeter across a dozen different factories, what did that say about their artillery shells or their aircraft engines? This realization led to a quiet, internal unraveling. The soldiers began to look at their American guards not with the hatred of a defeated warrior, but with the bewildered curiosity of a man who had been lied to. The softness they had been taught to despise was nowhere to be found. Instead, they saw a people who possessed such an abundance of resources that they could afford to be meticulous about the smallest details. The thread was no longer just a way to keep a uniform together. It was a line connecting the prisoner to the truth. They were not being held by a weak and dying nation. They were being held by a giant that cared enough about its individual parts to give them the means to repair themselves. The thread of doubt grew stronger with every repaired seam, pulling at the fabric of their loyalty until the entire tapestry of the rising sun's propaganda began to fray and fall apart. In the quiet of the POW barracks, the housewife kit evolved from a tool of utility into a profound symbol of American democratic philosophy. To the Japanese soldier, the kit represented a fundamental shift in how a state viewed the individual. In the imperial system, the soldier was a consumable resource, a bullet to be fired or a blade to be broken for the glory of the emperor. The idea of a government investing in the maintenance of a single man's trousers was antithetical to the logic of total sacrifice. Yet, as the prisoners handled the high-grade steel needles and the sturdy thimbles, they began to see the kit as an expression of care. It was a physical manifestation of a society that valued the dignity of the person, even in the midst of a global mechanical war. The American democracy did not just produce weapons. It produced the means for a man to maintain himself. This was the symbolism of care, the belief that a well-equipped and self-respecting individual was the most effective unit of a free nation.